Okay. I think I am all good to go here, except the lights and the door. Okay. Alrighty. So, it's Wednesday. In spring, that means almost the weekend, apparently. Okay, so this class, we're going to keep working on education. I'm sure we'll get through it. It is not a long unit compared to the last one. We've been doodling on the whiteboards. Don't like it. So we're going to finish up education, and then if you go on Canvas, what you'll see is in the lectures up to midterm 2, there should be a couple of extra PowerPoints. I'll just show you. And that are some sample questions. And what we're going to do is, once we get done the education stuff, we will jump in and kind of go through them together. And these are questions that used to be in the course and that I have subsequently taken out. Okay, so midterm 1 example questions. If you need to download them while we're finishing up education, they're not big. So there's 4 questions in there, and I'll kind of go through it with you. You can ask any questions you have, but I'll kind of show you how you would answer this, and we'll take any exam questions then, because the exam, of course, is next Wednesday, right? I've given you a 24-hour window to write it, right? So it'll open at midnight and it'll close at 11:59 p.m. We'll act as though you would take the first 90 minutes of the lecture to actually write the exam. So we'll start the class next week at 2:30 instead of at 1 o'clock. We'll do an hour and a half lecture, and then we'll, adjourn for the week because it's Victoria Day on Monday, and randomness abounds, and all of that fun stuff. Okay, any questions before I jump in to content for today? Okay, I guess I have to go back one slide. So a couple slides. So we ended off on this slide, right? We were talking about dropout rates and what affects dropout rates, right? We talked about macroeconomics, right? Or the kind of overall health of the economy. The hotter an economy is, the more likely people are to drop out if they can get good jobs with relatively minimal effort. Sorry, I just thought of one thing I need to do. I need to switch my microphone because now I can wander freely. Life is good again. Okay, right. So I was talking about this, and talking about how when oil was up at $100. Sorry, I still write money in French. I did all of my primary and secondary education in French, and so for me, the dollar sign will always follow the number, not the other way around. I know in English you put the dollar sign first. I've always thought English was ungrammatical because it's not like dollars 100, it's $100. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I'm forever locked into what I learned in elementary school. Okay, so lower socioeconomic class and certain kind of immigrant or minority backgrounds plays a role as well. In terms of what dropping out does, so the reasons that people would drop out, varied in surveys. Generally speaking, those who drop out, again, come from the kind of working class and the poor. And generally speaking, they have problems at school, right? They don't get along with teachers. They have poor grades. They probably have poor attachment to authority figures. Maybe they've attached to antisocial peers, and they get into trouble at school, and they often feel like they have little choice but to actually drop out of school. Often, too, the other thing that will lead people to drop out of school is some kind of economic compunction, right? They need money. Either because their families, need extra financial support, or they are themselves sort of, supporting members of their family. But it generally isn't always a positive experience, right? If you're poor, it might make more sense for you to drop out of school and earn money now than to stay in school for some kind of promise of a little bit of money going forward. People who are part of subcultures also tend to have high dropout rates. Whether it's like, I'm trying to think, the goth subculture used to have a really high dropout rate for whatever reason, probably due to, peers and school officials targeting them and treating them differently. Now, people experience, dropping out generally in a kind of ambiguous way, especially, if they've been having problems at school. They'll tend to experience as good in the short term, right? It relieves the stress of going to school, or maybe their financial situation improves, at least in the short term. But long-term problems are associated with this, right? Let's say that macroeconomic situation changes. Oil drops from $100 a barrel down to $41 a barrel, as kind of happened in 2015. And suddenly, there are layoffs in the oil patch. The people that they're keeping are the most highly skilled. And so the people who dropped out and just have a high school education are suddenly much less employable. They lag financially behind people with even a high school diploma. And so long term, it doesn't tend to work out very well. Even if for most people, even if in the short term, it can be a really positive experience. My one friend, she has 3 boys, and her middle boy, who's apparently gifted, although, to my opinion, you wouldn't know it, has been threatening to drop out of high school, right? Because he wants to start his own company, and he wants to be a lifeguard, because apparently in Calgary, lifeguards get paid like $30 an hour or something. And I'm like, okay, you said he was the smart one, right? He wants to drop out of high school. Would you like me to share with him some of these statistics on median wages for high school dropouts? Your average wage if you drop out of high school, by the way, $33,000 a year, roughly. Not anything to write home about. If you graduate from high school, you end up around, it's more closer to like 42K, which again is not, that's just high school. And you're up in the kind of in Canada median incomes in the 50K plus for a 4-year degree. And the upside is, of course, a lot higher. You can get way, way more than that, depending on how much education you have and where you are. But kind of averages around, between 50 and 55,000, depending on location. So, you're poor here, you're much less poor here. Okay, anyway, he's the smart one, apparently. He went to the gifted school, which, by the way, convinced me to never send any of my kids to a gifted school, because she also said going to a gifted school kind of turned him into a not nice person. Because he's like, I'm gifted, Mom. It's like, okay, this is going well. Sample size is too small to draw conclusions, but, doesn't sound good. All right, so post-secondary education. Post-secondary education has become much, much more important, largely because, we've entered a period of what we call a post-industrial economy, where somewhere in the range, like between 75 and 85% of people, and this depends on the country, but 75 and 85% of people are employed in what are called service industries, right? So service industries can vary widely in what they are, right? We have we have low tier service industries and we have high tier service industries. In the low tier, you'd have things like retail, sales, childcare, hospitality, beauty services, transportation, relatively low in the service industry. High tier, right, you'd have things like computer programmers, finance, nursing, education, other kinds of medical biotech, all the places you'd really like to be. All of the, lower tier generally doesn't require much for post-secondary education, but your higher tier of the service industry, generally speaking, requires, at least 4 years or more, right? And you're generally talking a bachelor's degree. I should have left more space on this slide to write a bachelor's degree. But, as we'll talk about in a second, increasingly even more education is being sought. Okay, so we've seen, surging demand for post-secondary education. And you see that reflected, right? So when we talked about the millennials, when we were talking about Jean Twenge's book, right? The most educated generation ever. That's why, right? Because they're aiming for, these higher tier jobs in the service industry, because those are the ones that are going to pay you the best. It's the ones that are going to give you that middle class or upper class lifestyle. So more people are pushing into post-secondary. Now, this has massively increased the number of people wanting to go into post-secondary institutions. And at times, post-secondary institutions and governments have been really slow to react. The reaction too has been, generally speaking, at least in Canada, to create more universities, right? To take programs that used to be, say, two-year certificate kind of granting institutions and turn them into universities. So places like, MacEwan, back, I don't remember how long ago, I want to say about 10 years ago, MacEwan wasn't a university, it was Grant MacEwan Community College, and generally speaking, people got 2-year kind of certificates and then would transition, to U of A or U of C or University of Lethbridge or somewhere else to complete a university degree, or they just got a 2-year certificate. Or what's the other one? King's. I guess there's 3. King's, I guess it's the King's. I'm just going to call it King's. University, used to be King's University College. And what's the other one? Oh, I just see ads now. They have a new logo. QE, or Q. By the way, terrible name. That's Concordia University of Edmonton, which used to be, again, Concordia University College. It used to also be a Lutheran seminary, but that's neither here nor there. So Edmonton, which used to have 1 degree granting institution, U of A, now has 4. So we've seen an increase, especially in university kind of degrees and this sort of thing. Now, the other thing, and you're probably aware of this, the other thing driving increased post-secondary enrollment and demand for post-secondary is demand from abroad, right? So you have expanding middle classes in developing countries, right? Now, they are aiming at kind of the same thing, right? Staggering over my words today. I must have 8 times more coffee. They are aiming for the same thing, right? They are developing or have developed service-based economies, especially ones that are based on knowledge. Now, the problem with a lot of country, I won't say third world, but developing countries is, while they've developed, these economies, they haven't developed the post-secondary system to support those economies yet, right? If you looked at a place like, India has far fewer university spots than it has people who want to attend university. And the institutions that are there are far less prestigious and well recognized than the ones that are in the West. So middle classes in developing countries, they want to educate their children, and increasingly they've pushed them into Western universities. Western universities have obliged, largely because they can charge those students, multiples of the same tuition in order to attend those same universities. So it's been a sort of cash cow, and it's kept a lot of, smaller smaller universities sort of afloat as they struggle to compete with a lot of other priorities. Okay, increasingly, and you hear this every now and then, and you're going to hear a lot of it in the next 3 to 5 years. It depends on how long this government lasts in Canada. You're going to hear a lot more of this. Right now, obviously, one of the big kind of bones of contention in the last election was, I'm going to change colors and see if I can make this appear better, housing, right? Oh, that is so much worse. Green? Even not gooder. Okay. Red it is. Maybe I just can't write on this graphic. That's okay. Housing. Right? A particular one. And construction trades. Housing. So every now and then, governments will get into their heads that we need more skilled workers, particularly in trades, right? So they start to push things like vocational programs. And we are in such a moment, right? This is something that I think both the Conservatives and the Liberals were talking about in the most recent election, is that we need to get more people into the skilled trades in order to build stuff. But increasingly too, governments want to put more focus on vocational training in general, or university programs or post-secondary programs that equal jobs, right? So something like teaching nursing, obviously the law, business and finance, which tend to output more directly into actual jobs rather than generalist degrees, right? So like vocational training is training that goes directly into a job. So any of the trades are this, and then things like, accounting. People love accounting. I don't like accounting. Accounting combines my fear of numbers with my fear of tiny boxes. So I have a few friends who are accountants, and I'm like, I have only one question. Why? It just sounds like a really terrible job. It's like, I look at spreadsheets all day. I'm like, okay, that doesn't sound fun. How do you not, terminate your existence? I don't know. I probably would. Okay, the other thing that we have is a lot of part-time students upgrading, especially as the economy really transforms quickly. People that trained in the past are sort of forced to go back for retraining, right? So to learn new skills, for the job market, new technologies come out. They need to, certify for these skills, gain these skills because they weren't being taught when they were, doing, say, an undergrad degree. And a lot of times companies outsource this to the individual, right? So it's like, look, if you want to gain those skills, you have to go and get it yourself. So all of this puts much more pressure on post-secondary institutions in general. Okay. So costs. Obviously, costs are a big concern when it comes to post-secondary, especially as it relates to questions of equity, right? Essentially, like if you need, that's a Y. If you need a post-secondary degree to succeed in the economy, but not everybody will have access to it because of the costs, right? If you're creating a class divide, this becomes a big problem, which is why you've had sort of periodic demands by, student groups to make post-secondary education free for all so that anyone who wants could get a post-secondary education. Okay, as it stands, I want to switch pen colors. Those with higher income parents are most likely to attend university. And there is what's sometimes referred to as the intergenerational transfer of advantage. I probably shouldn't write the whole thing, but I will. Okay, I switched into cursive at some point there. Intergenerational transfer of advantage, which basically just means, when it comes to education, if one of your parents went to university, you're about 50% more likely to attend and complete university yourself. If both your parents attended university, you're about 75% more likely. Now, if no one in your family attended university, only about 25% of individuals who neither parent attended university will end up attending and completing university. Okay, so advantage transfers, and a lot of the reasons are financial, lack of support, poor grades, in high school. That means they're having difficulty getting into these programs. Okay, now, the average debt load in Canada, and this is 2022, so I updated this a little while ago. It's about $20,000 for a university degree and $13,000 for like a community college program. So if you went, to like Grand Prairie Regional College, or what used to be Red Deer College, I think it's now Red Deer Polytechnic, average debt load is going to be about $13,000 through a degree, which is still not terrible, but definitely, still a fair bit of money. U.S. college inflation has risen much quicker than this. And I'll talk about why. So, American colleges are way more expensive, and these are the most recent numbers I could find. This is just tuition, right? So this doesn't include living expenses. This doesn't include books or food or anything. Basically, if you go to a community college in the U.S., right? So kind of the lowest tier of the U.S. education post-secondary system, you're looking at about, for a year, $3,700, which is pretty reasonable. But what you can expect to get out of one of those programs is considerably less, right, in terms of how hireable you're going to be. Okay, for your state college for state residents, it's about $26,000 a year, right? Which is about double what it is in Canada, right, where we're talking somewhere $13,000, $14,000 per year. $8,000 tuition and a bunch of book costs. Okay, for a state college, for a non-state resident, so if you move from, California to Indiana, right, you want to attend University of Notre Dame, you go to Indiana, I guess it's Notre Dame is not a state college, but let's pretend it was, or Ohio State. You wanted to go to Ohio State, right? You're looking at just short of $50,000. Just short of $45,000 a year for a non-state resident, which is a big issue in the U.S. because they have this weird culture where everybody wants to move away from home for college. For a private nonprofit college, there you go. That's University of Notre Dame or Duke. You're looking at, just shy of 55 grand. And that was a couple of years ago, so it's probably gone up. And then for an Ivy League school, right? If you want to go to, no one's wearing a Harvard t-shirt. I got one Oxford t-shirt one Oxford sweatshirt in the room, but no Harvard t-shirts. Usually there's a Harvard t-shirt kicking around. But if you want to go to Harvard, why did I say it like that? I don't know. If you want to go to Harvard, you're gonna shell out a cool 65 grand for tuition. That doesn't cover any of the living expenses in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? Same thing if you want to go to Princeton or Yale or I don't know, who wants to go to Columbia or Brown? Brown. Sorry, I'm joking. I got rejected from Brown. I'm not bitter. I tried to apply to do a postdoc at Brown. I didn't really want to go there anyway. I got rejected. I'm sad. Anyway, so you're looking at a cool 65K. With books and living expenses, right? You could be upward of $100, somewhere $60,000 to $80,000 a year. Sometimes turn into $100,000 a year. And obviously the Ivies are a particular case because having an Ivy League degree is usually considered like the instant passport to wealth and spectacular life. So very, very, very expensive. And U.S. college costs have grown much faster than the overall rate of inflation. Now, lots of people have suggested, when we talk about some of the the sorts of life struggles that different groups have, for millennials and Gen Z, one of the suggestions has been that the reason that we have this, what we call, emerging adulthood, right? This period of from 19 to 29, where you're sort of not quite fully an adult in some ways, right? You haven't hit all of those markers of adulthood, is because, you've had to pay so much tuition that you put other life goals like getting married, having children, owning a home on the back burner while you pay your student debt. So this was, by the way, the impetus for the Biden administration unsuccessfully attempted to, through executive orders, to pass student loan relief. I think it was up to $50,000 of student loan relief for people. It turns out you can't just write, an executive order in the U.S. presidency, basically saying that these people's debts are going to be paid by the U.S. taxpayers. But that was why, right? The Biden administration saw this as a kind of social justice issue. Now, that said, something like 80% of all college debt is actually held by people who went and got a master's degree or a PhD, which I think makes a strong case, that taxpayers probably shouldn't be, they're going to do great economically over time. The taxpayer probably shouldn't be the one on the hook for their tuition. But anytime you hear about like student loan relief or free education, this is the sort of impetus, right? It's like we're making it hard for our young people to start their lives because they're starting out with such big debt loads. What is it? If you wanted to be a billionaire, well, you should have been born to rich parents. Holy, my highly pressurized tea, apparently. Okay, almost killed me. All right, so student debts. Now, this is one of the sort of arguments, and it's kind of an interesting one, and I'll tell you. In the U.S., so in Canada and the U.S. have slightly different systems when it comes to student debt. Now, in both Canada and the U.S., one of the things that has happened is, and there's a bit of an argument here, how to put this. If we go back to the 1970s, right? Your lives are still being affected by decisions made in the 1970s, I'm sorry to say, by a bunch of people, many of whom are probably dead at this point. One of the things that people noticed was, people with a high school diploma, they would earn decent wages, right? Decent wages, they were kind of lower middle class. If you had an undergrad, you were probably middle class to upper middle class in terms of wages. And if you had a master's or PhD, you were probably closer to wealthy, upper class. The top 10% of society. So the decision was sort of made that we should try to push more people, from getting just a high school diploma to getting an undergrad degree. And one of the things that the US government did, and the Canadian government did this, but not quite the same extent, was, sorry, what was I saying? Yes, before I switch slides. They guaranteed the debt in a couple of ways. So in the US, the US federal government basically backs all of the student loans that are made. They're typically made by commercial banks to individuals. Now, student loans are not always a great bet because there's no collateral, right? Like, you are investing in yourself. The problem is if your investment in yourself doesn't play out, the bank can't come and chop off an arm, right? Like if you buy a car or you build a business, they can repo your business or your house or your car or whatever. They can't repo you yet. Slavery is still not legal. So maybe someday. So the way to kind of get around this and the fact that banks weren't that interested in giving loans to students, because, for some, not all students anyway, certainly a student with a degree in fine arts or drama Doesn't always look like a great financial bet. Like the financial return on that is potentially not going to be great. Basically what they said is we will guarantee those loans. And the way that they did this is that they made student loans non-dischargeable. So in the US, you could declare bankruptcy 17 times, and it would do nothing to your student debt, because student debt by US law is non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, right? So you declare bankruptcy, and generally bankruptcy means your creditors will come and take your stuff, but you would still be stuck paying your student debt, right? Because it is non-dischargeable. Basically, the only way out of it is to die. Not recommended. So this gave a kind of security to the banks to put a whole bunch of student loans out there, because it doesn't really matter. You're not taking any risk because you're going to be made whole on these loans anyway, because no one is ever going to be able to not pay you, right? If you're, you could go until 75 and not pay off your student loans, right? You could go your whole life, you could declare bankruptcy 27 times. You'll never be able to get away from that, and they can garnish your wages and assets and all of that stuff. So this allowed banks to give out a lot more student loans, which meant a lot more people going to university. And one of the things that happens when there's a lot of money going around, right, is basic economics. The price, the cost goes up. And that is exactly what's happened in the US system with every government intervention to increase the amount of money available or increase the number of people going to post-secondary. More, it's gotten more and more expensive to the point where it's really, obviously really, really expensive, right? $60,000 to $80,000 a year, potentially. Okay, so that's what happened in the US. Canada, I tell you the sad truth. In a sense, all this did in a lot of ways was shift kind of, the average wage earners, kind of lower middle class to middle class, into the undergrad category. And actually, it's now people with a master's or a PhD that end up upper class or wealthy. You don't tend to see most people with undergrad degrees in that category, unless you count lawyers, because technically a JD is an undergraduate degree for some reason. Okay, Canada's slightly different. Canada is not quite as, even though we made relatively the same choices, we've wanted to push a lot more people into universities. Canada's system is not quite as, I don't know how to describe the American system, cutthroat, maybe is the right word. So in Canada, student debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy after 7 years following the end of the last year in which the person attended any type of schooling, right? So, if you go and do an undergrad degree and then you do a master's after, it'll be 7 years after the end of your master's that your the loans you took for your undergraduate degree are dischargeable, or any of them, right? Okay. And the government basically stopped dealing with this. They stopped managing it directly in the 2000s, and they turned it over to the 5 big banks, right? So Royal Bank, Toronto Dominion, Scotia, Royal Bank, TD, Bank of Montreal, and CIBC. Every year I remember all of them, but it takes a little bit of effort because I always forget the Canadian International Bank of Commerce. Okay, so now as the banks go, if you try to default on your loan or you try to stop paying it, they go with pretty aggressive means to get you to pay your student debts. So, it is slightly problematic, right? It goes to collections agencies, it can ruin your credit and all of that stuff. And yeah, all of this has led to a lot of debates. Do we need as much education in the economy as we think we do, right? And we'll talk about this when we get to the chat or the unit on work. But increasingly jobs that probably don't really need it. I'll talk about the first job I really had out of university later on. It's a traumatic story. One that I still actually have nightmares about it. I had one like a couple days ago, but that's neither here nor there. a lot of jobs that don't actually require an undergraduate degree in terms of skills will be looking for an undergraduate degree, or will only hire people with undergraduate degrees for some reason. I still haven't figured that one out. So we've made an economy where basically the undergrad degree is increasingly sort of the base degree that you need to move forward, without necessarily, increasing the reward for those things. And we've created a lot of jobs that ask for undergrad degrees that probably don't need them. But again, we'll talk about that later on. Okay, this is in the US, right? Cost, grants and loans for US undergrads. And you see, right, grants and loans rose a little bit, but costs have absolutely like skyrocketed in terms of how much kind of average costs are. Okay, ooh. From Harvard admissions Instagram. Starting in 2025-26, school and associated costs will be completely free for students from families earning $100,000 or less. Cool. At least with at least free tuition for those families making up to $200,000. Okay. I mean, that would be amazing if Harvard did that. That's cuckoo banana birds. I don't know how they could manage that, except that Harvard has a massive endowment. $100,000 a year is a lot of money. With at least free tuition for those families making up to $200,000. Yeah, that's interesting. I can't imagine Harvard doing that. Harvard is a big money printing machine, but I could be wrong. That could be interesting. I suspect this is part of their current battle with the US federal government. They're currently in a slap fight with the Trump administration, as are we all. Because the US federal government basically said they're taking away a bunch of Harvard's federal funding, but we will see. That would be interesting. I had not heard that. Okay, can I explain why, even though there's a high demand for post-secondary education, also vocational training, how do they go together, if at all? I mean, okay, so a lot of post-secondary education is vocational, right? So if you think of like nurses, that's a vocational program. It's one that you get, in university. Teachers, accountants, right, is post-secondary degree. I think we have an accounting degree at U of A, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know in what faculty. Engineering, right, is a vocation, right? It's considered a vocational degree. But then also, right, any program at NAIT like plumbing, welding, okay, maybe not welding. No, definitely welding, sorry. I have friends who are plumbers, and they always joke about welders. Like the joke that my one friend always tells me is, what do you say to a guy with an IQ of 50? Nice weld. Implying that welders aren't that smart. So, I mean, he's a plumber, so I don't know what that says. But those are all vocational degrees as well. All right, so they kind of go hand in hand. We have a lot of vocational degrees that are run through post-secondary institutions. And even like, lawyer is a vocational degree, a really, really prestigious one. So one of the things that governments tend to want is to push people out of generalist degrees and into kind of vocational programs, because they feel happier funding things where they know people are going to at least have a career path, rather than kind of like, okay, I graduated with a Bachelor of Science, now what? Or a Bachelor of Arts, now what, right? So that's kind of how it goes together. I don't know why this slide is blank. I probably wanted to write something. Okay. So, education, social class, right? Educational attainment and eventual employment attainment are strongly tied to family background. So how much education you're going to get and how well you're going to do in the working world are highly tied to family background. Every additional year of school parents have means a 5% greater likelihood of their children attending university. And there's a strong, if we want to talk about kind of cultural capital, there's a strong cultural capital kind of element to this, right? Parents who went to university and who then, do well in life, right? They've got good jobs, they've got good salaries that allow them to support their family. They're going to tend to see, they're going to raise kids that believe education is important. Those kids then go on typically to do better in school because they're being supported by parents. They're being taught by parents how to navigate the school system, how to talk to teachers and all of that. And they tend then to do better, right? They carry with them a lot of that middle class cultural capital into the school system that allows them then to succeed. And it's kind of onward and upward. Pierre Bourdieu makes this argument. I can't remember which book it is now. I can see the cover, but I can't read the title on the cover for some reason. I can see it in my head. I know exactly what it looks like. It's purple. I'll think of it later, and then I'll come back to this slide and be like, that was the one. That basically education is a big class sorting system, right? That basically education, because kids from working class and lower, like poor backgrounds, will have different kind of values and aptitudes going into school. They'll often clash with the school system, which means they don't do as well. And something like, for working class children, their actual kind of desire in terms of academic attainment declines the longer they're in school, according to Bourdieu. But yeah, there's a lot of things where your cultural capital, where you come from, is going to affect your life outcomes in major ways. All right. Right, so children from higher income backgrounds, some things, they have better literacy rates. Oh, it's in a different class. I think it's in SOC 100. I have this great graphic in one of my slides where, they have two kids, both of the same IQ, and then there's the one from the poor background, and he's just standing on the ground. And this is how well he'll do in school. And the one from the rich background is standing on these different shelves, basically. It's like, private tutoring, music lessons, parental support, all this kind of stuff. So parental background has a great deal to do with a whole bunch of academic outcomes, right? So kids from higher income backgrounds tend to have higher literacy rates. Sorry, I just had a really random thought. I mean, among the things with literacy rates is that, parents, middle class, upper class, tend to have a little bit more time. We'll talk about marriage later on in the course. They're more likely to be married, which means they can split kind of duties, spend more time with their kids, and including doing things like reading to their children. And I can't remember. I think I want to say it was in the New York Times, but I could be wrong. There was an article, just recently, and it was from a conflict scholar that basically said, reading to your kids is a social justice issue. Now, it was advocating a kind of cuckoo banana birds sort of position, which was middle class and upper class parents should forego reading to their children to basically bring them down, in terms of literacy rates, closer to, the level of parents who don't have the opportunity to do so, which is, a little bit of a kooky take. But, it kind of was pointing at this issue, that basically things like literacy rates are different based on how much time parents spend reading to kids and reading with them. So the richer you are, the more likely you are to be engaged. You will tend to have more social capital and cultural capital, which you will pass on to your kids, right? I'll talk about this. I thought I had another slide on this, but I think I took it out. Upper income parents tend to teach their kids how to interact with the adult world, right? And here, this is cultural capital. Right? And upper income parents, right, will tend to foster the qualities and interests of their children, right? And again, remember earlier in the course, we talked about this kind of notion of, from Rousseau, that children are like a precious flower, and you need to, whatever the qualities of that flower are, you need to fertilize them, right? You need to fertilize it and let that plant grow how it would be, right? And this is essentially what upper class parents do. Oh yeah, sorry, Chloe.
What's the difference between the social and cultural capital?
An excellent question. Can I finish my idea and then I'll answer your question? Great. What was my idea? Can you? No. I got you. Children are like a precious flower. Right. So they'll tend to find that thing their kid is good at, right? Whether it's hockey, horseback riding. What other horrifyingly expensive hobbies are there? Music lessons, drama, whatever it is, and foster those, art, mathematics, computer programming, and foster that, right? Really build that up. Okay, the difference between cultural and social capital. Okay, so cultural capital. Hang on, maybe I'll go back to my blank slide. Erase my happy face. Okay, so social capital relates to essentially, I guess, who you know. What am I doing? Who you know. And how you're able to use who you know to help have those people help you, get what you want. So think of it this way, right? Like if, let's say, your son or daughter wants to be a lawyer, right? And you happen to, in your social network, let's say in whatever community you're in, you happen to know a bunch of lawyers. What you can do then is talk to those people and be like, hey, little Jimmy is really interested in being a lawyer, and it would be really helpful if he could intern in your law office this summer, right? He'll do anything, just wants to be around it to gain the experience and see what being a lawyer looks like. Well, immediately, and then they're like, yeah, of course, I'm we're friends, so I'm glad to help you out, and little Jimmy, gets that itch, right? So when he's applying to law school, and they're looking at his curriculum vitae, it's like, wow, he's been interning at that law office since he graduated from high school. Like every summer, he gets a position at that law office, and he works there. So you've used your social connections to advance someone, right? So generally speaking, the higher up you are in class, the more social capital you have, right? Because you're prestigious, and it's likely that you know other prestigious people and that you have something to offer them. They have something to offer you, right? Because, maybe I'm an engineer. I'm not an engineer, obviously. But, my kid wants to intern at your law office. Your kid wants to, intern or co-op at my engineering firm, right? So we scratch each other's backs. So that's social capital. It's basically who you know. And you might, anytime you hear it's not what you know, it's who you know as a kind of cliche, they're really talking about social capital, right? Okay. I'll draw a hard line on social capital. Cultural capital. Maybe I'll ask you a question. If someone walked into an interview and they sat down and with the person who's interviewing, and they're like, "Hey, bro, how does that go? How does that come off?" Too casual. Okay. Why? Okay, good. If you walk into a job interview at a law firm wearing shorts and a t-shirt, what is immediately going to happen? You're not going to do good, right? I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot. Those are all things that are cultural capital, right? it's essentially how you're able to present yourself in order to like get yourself forward in life. And this can be, convincing people that, you're worth the investment, that they should put time and effort into you, that you are already, someone who is valuable. You know things, you know things, you know how to present yourself. You're going to generally be helpful. Yeah, please.
Would it also kind of relate to like social norms in a way? Just because like everything you've seen with the interview, I feel like it's just like social norms, like you know that you're supposed to dress a certain way and act a certain way and like present yourself professionally, like if you're trying to get into like a certain profession.
But not everyone knows this, right? Because certain people will approach social situations. That's maybe a very extreme, right? I don't think most people are going to be like, sup, at a job interview. But you're going to have people with varying levels of schmooze, right? I don't know if schmooze is not a good word, but I'm using schmooze anyway, right? Their ability to like convince people. So that's part of it. Okay, so typically it's non-tangible. So it's not, it's non-tangible. But it's going to, cultural capital is how much you're seen as being prestigious, worthwhile, upright, and all of these things. So it can be things like degrees, right? Like the second, and I think in a lot of cases this is unearned, but that you tell someone that you have a PhD, people feel like that's an impressive achievement. I, having done one, tend to think you were too stupid to quit. But there you go, right? So a degree, right? What's more prestigious? Is it a BA or a PhD, right? Obviously that person carries more respect. Why? Because they have a PhD, right? So there's a level of cultural capital. Clothing. So I mean, like I'm wearing a suit the suit jacket from Moores. If someone was in this room with me and they're wearing an Armani suit, right? Which of those carries more weight? The Armani, right? A lot of it is related to status, right? So, let's say cars. Cars. Let's say I am driving my trusty Dodge Grand Caravan. Hopefully not for much longer. And someone else is driving. I'm gonna sound like Andrew Tate. A Bugatti. How does he say it? He says it really weird. I'm driving my Bugatti. Right? There's a kind of social cachet with those things. Okay. So I'm going to say one other thing. Because there's a couple of other things, right? Obviously, language carries social capital, right? So if you are able to speak well, right, politely, you can express yourself without, cursing, more social capital. So how you present yourself, how you speak, your vocabulary, right, all of these things. If, like me, you have a prodigious lexicon, no, I'm kidding. That's just a pretentious way of saying I know a lot of words. You're going to come off better. You're going to carry more social capital. So there's that. And then interests, right? Interests and hobbies. If you know a lot about classical music, to people who like classical music, that's going to carry a lot of cultural capital. If you are really good at golf, right? Or you like playing golf, to a lot of people, that's going to carry cultural capital because golf itself is, it's a little bit of a middle class, upper class kind of hobby, right? So music, golf. I have my one friend who's like, I would call him an extreme social climber. And in the last 5 years, he has invested just a tremendous amount in getting better at golf. Because he's like, this is how I'm going to, convince more and more of these even higher status people than me that I'm worthwhile, that they can trust me, that they should lend me money, they should partner with me on projects, is I'm going to play a lot of golf with them. I can tell you his wife loves this. She does not, because in the summer he's gone 4 nights a week playing golf. absolutely mad. He takes some of his friends on a golfing trip. And I think he said one day they golfed like 36 holes. And I'm like, because you don't like yourself? Like, what is wrong with you? Anyway, I don't like golf. My golf clubs, and I'm actually more proud of this than I should be, are a set of golf clubs that I took out of the trunk of a rental car when I worked at a rental car company, because the person just forgot them and then flew back to Ontario. And so I inherited this really terrible set of golf clubs, and it's still the golf clubs I use to this day, mostly to play with that one guy I just talked about. But for him, it's very important, right? Okay, have I gone on about cultural capital enough? Did I answer your question? Okay, excessively? Because that's how I like to answer. No, I like to answer questions excessively. Okay. Anything else for cultural capital? I mean, awards, obviously, if you have, the reason everybody wants an Oscar in Hollywood is because that matters. All that kind of stuff. That's also the reason people will pay for things like, I had one friend, he's very successful, same golf guy. When he was in his, he just turned 40. So he was in his 30s. One of the kind of local magazines featured him in the top 30 or top 40 under 40, Edmonton's top 40 under 40. And I only found out later that you actually have to pay. It's like $1,000 to be considered for that list. And he very happily paid the $1,000 because he's like, well, I'm one of the top 40 under 40. And then he told me, it actually doesn't mean anything. I pay, you pay to be even considered. And the guys who are really high up don't even care. Anyway, so those kinds of things matter as well. All right. Where am I? Totally lost. Oh, my clock turned off. What time is it? 2 o'clock. Okay. How much education stuff do I have left? Not very much. All right. Well, who knows? We might end early today. We still have some stuff to go over. All right. Credentialism. All right. Oh, this is our fun slide. This is again from Generations, from Gene Twenge's book. But I pulled it out here because it's fun. The percentage of U.S. incoming college students saying they went to college to make more money versus to gain a general education and appreciation of ideas, right? So we see, again, this is when Gen X comes into the education market. What you see is, and here, right here, the boomers, more and more of them, come in to make money, and slightly fewer, go in order to gain a general education and appreciation of ideas. Okay, now I will say the other thing with this chart that's interesting is along with this transition, right? And that other one we talked about in terms of Gen X, that shift from, to be financially well off to, a meaningful philosophy of life. That was back in the unit on generations. This ultimately shifted, people, what kinds of degrees they did. When you get to this kind of inflection, right around there, you get a big shift towards a couple of things. One is engineering. Engineering, because it's seen as highly profitable. Medicine has always been prestigious, so medicine's not there. Science, engineering, and those types of degrees, right? More the STEM fields really gain more steam. And you see a huge decline in the humanities and social sciences, right? These guys go up, though this one goes down when you get to this kind of inflection point, because you make way less money here, right? These ones, you make more money. So, every generation kind of since Gen X, like the boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, each of them have become more and more educated over time. But generally speaking, again, once you hit this inflection point, we've changed the types of degrees that are highly aspirational, right? The ones that people really, really want. And we've tended to move away from the humanities and social sciences. So in the past, right, something like a degree in English would have been seen as fairly prestigious, specifically because you were engaging in, and sometimes you still have people sort of living in this space. I'm going to erase my own stuff here. I'm going to switch to purple. I don't know why. You were engaged in a sort of like, I guess like a civilizational conversation. So something like, you've heard of a degree in the liberal arts or a liberal education. This was the goal, right? And it was, you went to university to become like a well-rounded person, right? Someone who was well-read, right? Someone who had read a lot of books, a lot of especially the classic books, who had engaged in, kind of classical philosophy, who was in touch with the sort of ideas that had made their civilization what it was, right? And this was kind of the goal, back here. Now, this shifts, right? For lots of different reasons, individualism being one of them. There's a sort of reconsideration of in what esteem we should hold, say, Western civilization. This happens especially in the 1990s. People start to rethink, is Western civilization really so great? The most popular classes in university used to be, Western civilization. And basically all of these courses disappeared in the 1990s, right? As universities, reflecting on, rightly, I think, on the legacy of colonialism and imperialism, are like, well, maybe there's some problems and we shouldn't glorify Western civ. Along with that, though, you get a decline in kind of, what we think of as a liberal education or the liberal arts, and people much more interested in, not being, say, a well-rounded person. What's the value in having read 20 plays by Shakespeare? Maybe not anything financial. It was always seen as more, it turns you into a well-rounded person who can discuss things, who understands, kind of the context and has experienced things through things like literature, poetry, history, and all of that. So all of that kind of goes away, and we get a shift much more towards hard sciences, engineering, and vocational paths. All right, hopefully that made some sense. All right. All right, so what role does gender play when we talk about education? I just need to look at where I'm at. Okay, good. I thought I had missed something, but I don't. I think maybe I did. Okay, before I do this, I want to talk about one more thing. Because I used to have a slide that was titled Educational Inflation, and I may have taken it. I shifted this unit. I cut it down a little bit last term. Oh yeah, I will talk about this because I want to. I'm going to go back to this blank slide. I'm going to erase some stuff. I'm going to apologize because I forgot to talk about a couple of terms that are important. All right. Because this one's important. Because this is something that's afflicting all of you. I think I talk about it in the work unit, but we'll talk about it here as well. Educational inflation. Right. So, people who didn't come to class and only review the slides will be very confused by this blank slide that has now become my canvas. All right, so educational inflation. So you know what inflation is, right? Inflation, in monetary terms, is the more money is in the system, right, the less money is worth. So if the Canadian government decides, as it did under Justin Trudeau, to double the amount of Canadian dollars that are in circulation, it's going to decrease what the Canadian dollar is worth. So educational inflation is basically the same concept, but having to do with degrees, right? So the more bachelor degrees there are, so more of these, the value declines. Okay, so the argument is that as we've gone through this period where governments have pushed more people into undergraduate education, we've generated a lot more bachelor's degrees, right? And as I was talking about earlier, right, it used to be just U of A in Edmonton that could grant bachelor's degrees, but now you have MacEwan, you have King's, or the King's, and you have Concordia University of Edmonton, all of whom can grant undergraduate degrees. And what this has done is the total number of degrees has gone up, right? We have way more degrees today than we did, degree holders today than we had 20 years ago. But those degrees get you less and less, right? Whereas back in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, a bachelor's degree would have been a ticket to, say, a pretty good middle-class job. Increasingly, the bachelor's degree is seen as the sort of entry into the workplace, right? And so what the high school diploma used to be, right? Your high school diploma used to be your base qualification. People used to say, what are you going to do without a high school diploma, right? Because it was seen as the base qualification, the very minimum standard of education that was going to get you into decent jobs. That's no longer the case, right? The base qualification today is the bachelor's degree. And so a lot of people will say, a master's is the new bachelor's, right? So now the entry point into those really good jobs that used to be available with an undergrad degree is now a master's degree. And I will say this trickles all the way up, right? We've massively increased the number of all of these kinds of degrees, right? So a PhD is a new master's. And a postdoc, can't write. Postdoctoral fellowship is the new PhD, right? And I can confirm this, right? If you have a PhD today, it is really, really stinking hard to get a job. I count myself tremendously lucky to be here and to have I'm a teaching professor in the Department of Sociology, and I am absolutely one of the lucky ones because I barely have a PhD, right? A lot of we just hired someone in criminology, Lindsay Bing. I think she has 2 postdoctoral fellowships, right? Did 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one in Texas and one at Columbia, I think. I can't remember now their CV. But they put, when it was in the pool, it was like, okay, of course we're going to pick this person because they have these really prestigious postdocs. So we've seen educational inflation all the way up the education ladder, but where it hits most is in this base qualification level. Because it used to be, right, that to get a job, as management somewhere, right, managing a restaurant or managing, a rental car company or some kind of business, you could get there basically with, say, a high school diploma. Now you can't, right? And it was funny, I have one friend, his name is Josh, and he started a bachelor's degree in economics, hit econometrics, and could not finish econometrics because econometrics is really stinking hard. It's a lot of really hard math. And he flunked out, and then he went to work for his father-in-law, And he worked for his father-in-law for 15 years, but all he has is a high school diploma. His father-in-law sold the company. The guy that bought the company didn't like him, so he let him go. And then he spent about a year and a half looking for a job and basically ran into this problem, right? He only had a high school diploma. He had 15 years experience managing, I can't remember. It was some kind of, construction company or trades company, 15 years of experience, and couldn't get a job because everyone was like, you need a certificate in project management or a bachelor's degree of some kind. He has 2 kids and a wife and didn't have time. Finally, what he did is he just borrowed a bunch of money from his father-in-law and bought his own company, which he's now managing. But that's the sort of dilemma we find ourselves in, right? We've raised the very base qualification. You're not even going to be considered to get in the door, regardless of experience, without a bachelor's degree of some kind. And again, you want those really good jobs. Now you're in here and here, and here. God help us. Postdoctoral fellowships are horribly exploitative, and it really, really sucks, right? Because you've now done your PhD and you're being asked to move somewhere for, I think when I applied to Brown, the pay for the postdoctoral fellowship, and I think it's Providence, not a cheap place to live, it was $33,000, right? That's what they were going to pay for a year, right? So you don't get paid much, but you get, to work with a prestigious scholar of some kind. So it's extremely exploitative. But then, after, 2 years of a master, 5 to 7 years of a PhD, 2 to 4 years of postdoc, maybe you have a shot at a research professor kind of job at a major university. So all of this has gone up, but there's still relatively few PhDs. I'm sorry. I'm merely being depressing. I'm just telling you all that you're doomed. I'm sorry. I can write some of you letters if you're applying for master's degrees, I promise. Just mention the blank slide with all the sadness on it. Anyway. Sad. Tear. Okay. Anyway, this is just sort of the reality, right? We're in an era of educational inflation, meaning you need more and more education to kind of get ahead of the game. Okay. I promise not to return to the blank slide again, unless I have to. Okay, I could probably finish this. Oh. As someone doing a minor in English right now, you wish you hadn't. I feel ya. My major was English as part of my bachelor's degree, and I loved it. Don't get me wrong. I'm a pretty good writer, and I think it's mostly because I wrote a lot of papers in English. So don't despair. It will pay off probably. You're getting a BA in psych. Oh, I remember seeing this, and this was in the was it the Times Education Review? They ranked the combination of a psych major, SOC minor, or the reverse, SOC major, psych minor, as the least useful degree you can get in university. And I probably shouldn't tell you that because probably 80% of you have that combination in some way, shape, or form. Because it's a really popular combination. Sorry. I promise to tell you the truth. I won't sugarcoat it too much. Don't worry. Everything will work out. Maybe. All right, what am I talking about? Pink collar jobs. All right, so gender. All right, so feminists. Kind of your feminists or your conflict feminists especially have tended to stress conflict feminism, or just feminism in general, have tended to stress the idea that early socialization and sex role stereotypes continue to play a really strong role in the careers that women choose. So, when we talk about the fields that women tend to choose, they tend to be still overwhelmingly things that are traditionally female-dominated occupations and the educational paths that lead to them, right? So women still tend overwhelmingly to what are called pink collar jobs, right? traditionally female-dominated occupations. So things like, teaching, nursing, social work are dominated by women. And it's funny because, yeah, mostly women in here. It's funny because I teach occasionally one class for engineers, right? So it's 366, people in an industry. And it's always kind of weird to walk into that classroom because, in sociology, it tends to be at about an 80-20 female to male split. And then you walk into engineering classes and it's precisely the opposite. It's like an 80-20 split the other way. Women still overwhelmingly go into these into these fields. And if you go into education, it's like 85% female. It's really heavily female dominated. Nursing, even worse. Okay, so teaching, nursing, social work. The argument is part of this is socialization, right? That women and girls are socialized from very young to think that, things like science, technology, engineering, math are for boys and that they are better suited for, what we would call the caring professions, right? Those that require more empathy. Women also, on the whole, tend to continue to put a higher focus on marriage and family and often choose careers that match those expectations. And here, the kind of claim that's being made is that they're not going to go into, say, high status, but high demand professions. So things that would require you to, say, sacrifice your personal life are things that you're generally not going to see women do as much, right? So, things like, let's say partner in a law firm or surgeon, right? These are things that, generally speaking, you're not going to see, according to this kind of argument, women doing as often because those things would sort of push against, other things like having a family, make it harder to balance, and so women are less likely to enter those fields. Okay. Sad face. Sorry. Thank you for the hope. See, now you have me thinking of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Everything is garbage. You find something you care about, it's taken from you. Your colleague, your dream job, your mango yogurt. Never love anything. Sorry. I'll play that clip later, maybe. You'd rather not know the truth. Sorry. Is a soc-psych combo good for law? Sometimes. It depends where you're going, obviously. In like U of A, it's all grades and LSATs, right? They don't actually care about what you're doing in terms of, they just care about your grades. Other places, it's not bad. Crim Psych is better on the whole. I'm not pumping up the Crim program, but, I work at the Crim Center, so maybe. All right, what do we got here? Did I skip a slide? No, I'm good. All right, so we see general trend in secondary and higher education is more women completing programs. We see many more women enrolling today in undergraduate programs, and it depends on where you are. U of A is a little bit more even because of the way the distribution is set in terms of programs, and it's something like almost 50-50, like 55-45 split. But in places that are more towards the liberal arts, you often have a 70-30 split in terms of women to men earning degrees, right? And we have, this is kind of a global trend, especially in Canada, the US. We have more women in Canada today holding undergrad degrees than men. Now, that said, not all degrees are equal and not all degrees offer the same kind of earning potential, right? So, sorry, I'm going to go back for a sec. These things, right? Teaching, nursing, and social work, they are good careers, but they are also what's referred to as non-scalable. And so their wages or salaries tend to be capped, right? So what does non-scalable mean? I will explain. So think of it this way, right? If you're like, say, an engineer or programmer, and you invent something, right? You invent a new widget or a new doodad, a new computer program that does something fabulous, right? Whatever it happens to be, that new app for the iPhone, the killer app, you can easily scale that, right? You can get lots of installs. You can get lots of people using it. You can include like in-app purchases, right? You can scale that up, right? You can make a lot of money. So that career is scalable. Something like teaching and nursing are not scalable, right? Because you can only teach, a certain number of students. If you try to stick 1,000 first graders in a room, you're not going to end up with any good results. And same thing with nursing, right? You can only have so many patients. So there's really no way, patients. There's really no way to increase, how many people you're treating or anything like that beyond a very, very certain number. So these careers are, teaching, nursing, same thing with social work or anything like that. They're non-scalable. So what tends to happen is your salaries end up being capped. And it usually ends up that you're, in both of these careers especially, you are part of a union, a collective agreement with a government that sets your salaries, meaning, after a certain point, your salary will never go up. As opposed to an engineer or a programmer, where potentially the sky's the limit, right? You could become Elon Musk. You might not want to, but you could in theory. Okay, so back to this slide. More women are enrolling in undergrad programs. More women are getting undergrad degrees. Now, you can see, we have our share of men. This is a kind of interesting chart from Stats Can. STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. We see, more men in STEM fields, right? Generally speaking, traditional STEM. Even more, the disparity between men and women is even more evident in math-intensive STEM fields, right? That are very much dominant. So think like engineering. A lot of types of engineering would be there. Disproportionate number of men. Even if you include healthcare, like STEM fields like medicine, right? Still way more men than women enrolled. When you go to less intensive, right? Less math-intensive STEM fields, things like biology, biotech, right? These are much closer, much closer in terms of the breakdown. All right, and then non-STEM healthcare, so things like nursing, women outnumber men. Non-STEM business and related fields, slightly male focused, and then all other non-STEM. Right, so that's you. Bachelor's degree, all other non-STEM fields, that's you. And you see women vastly outnumber men in those fields. Okay, so no questions. Okay, women now earn also not just undergrad degrees, but more degrees than men at the graduate level. Again, this is concentrated in social science, humanities, fine arts, education, and nursing. When you go to things like engineering, math-intensive STEM fields, computer science, right? These are still dominated by men. We just produce a lot more of these. Okay, women are still, as we saw here, right, underrepresented in our STEM fields. Still entering, overwhelmingly enter careers in teaching, nursing, social work, earning degrees in humanities and social science. However, all right, we'll put this in the traditional feminist argument box. There are signs that things are changing. I'm going to change colors and we're going to go to green. All right, as of 2022 in Canada, female physicians, right, women doctors, continues to rise, and here are some fun facts. 47 or 49.7% of family physicians in Canada are now female. And basically, yeah, by 54% of physicians under the age of 40 are women. So within a couple of years, as some of the older male doctors start to retire, right, that is probably going to skew slightly. So there's going to be more female physicians than male physicians. Specialist physicians, about 40% of specialists in Canada today are female. And yeah, by 2030, half of all physicians in Canada will be women. So that is, a high status profession that has been male dominated for a long time, that is now shifting increasingly to women dominating it, right? More women going into these fields. Same thing with law. In 2017, about half of law school graduates were women, a little bit more than half, and they are currently slightly more than 51% of enrolled law students. Now, that said, they still make up a small minority, or like about a quarter, I guess, a little more than a quarter of partners in law firms, about 27% versus 20.22% in 2013, right? So in a 10-year period, it's increased about 5%. Women are still less likely to become partners in law firms because that's a huge investment of time, and it gets in the way of things like having children and a family, because you have to put in, huge hours. You find the same thing with pharmacists. Women are less likely right? Men are much more likely to be franchise owners than women are in terms of pharmacies. So women are much more likely to just work as pharmacists. And it's kind of similar to the what's this percentage? It's about 40% of franchise owners are women, about 60% are men in terms of pharmacy. So things are better than they were in the past, but how shall we say this? In terms of women and education, they're earning more. The results remain a little bit mixed. There are certainly signs that there's still some struggles, especially, getting women interested in STEM programs. But they're definitely moving into some sectors. Okay. Oh, one other thing to say. I do want to say one other thing here. Should I go back to the blank slide to say it? No, I'll just say it here. There seems to be, and there's an argument made, social psychologists will often make this argument, that at least some of this might not be due to socialization. Is it socialization? Question mark. But actually, some people suggest that it's more related to disposition, which might have a biological component. And here, some of the evidence that's sometimes presented is that if you take countries that are extremely egalitarian, right? And so let's say you took probably one of the most gender egalitarian countries in the world, Sweden, right? Very egalitarian views. Finland is the same, by the way. Finland and Sweden are super egalitarian. What's kind of weirdly happened in both of these places is, as they've grown more egalitarian, right, you've actually seen the split in terms of like STEM and non-STEM versus non-STEM for women get worse, with fewer women choosing to go into STEM fields, despite the fact that, from a social perspective, from a social support perspective, there's not a cost. They both have education systems that are broadly, no cost to their citizens. But they've continued to struggle to get women to go into the STEM fields, and it's actually gotten worse, to the point where in 2024, the Swedish government issued a big report sounding a sort of alarm that women weren't going into STEM, right? They were going into, our traditionally, female-dominated occupations, education, nursing, and these sorts of things, rather than STEM fields. Just led some people to suggest that this is a dispositional thing, that women are simply more interested in compassionate professions, right? That the reason more women go into, traditionally female-dominated occupations are that that's what they're interested in, right? They're less interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That men are simply more interested in this for whatever reason. And then, they hold up Sweden and Finland as examples of this, that we have, ultimately, even egalitarian societies will tend in this direction. So either, the Swedes remain very sexist in their socialization, or there's something else going on. But again, not every social psychology is not social biosci is not everybody's bag. Okay, I got like 3 slides left, but I am desperately needing a break because my throat is getting scratchy. If we take a break till 3 o'clock, we can come back. I got 2 slides left, and then we can switch over to talking about the exam a little bit, if that works for you. So yeah, come back at 3, and we'll kind of go from there, because I think 15 minutes will be enough to finish up and talk about all that we have left to talk about. All right, we'll see you in a couple minutes. Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah. All right, I guess I will get started here again. We'll try to finish up and maybe we'll see if we finish up a little bit early. Okay, so did I finish up here? I did. Okay, so boys. So we talked about women, girls and women. Increasingly, we see a lot of arguments and a lot of evidence suggesting that boys and men are struggling a lot. I think this is a really interesting book. It's a little bit dated now. It's a little bit dated now, but kind of, when was this? I think it was published about in the 2010s. I can't remember the exact year. I think this book was kind of an interesting leading indicator for people who are starting to notice that boys and men were having some problems starting in education, but increasingly rolling through into the workforce. One of the more recent ones is Reeves. I can't remember his first name now. Ryan Reeves, who wrote a book of boys and men, which has become a bestseller about the kind of crisis that men and boys are going through. Okay, so it's Richard Reeves. Jeez, Richard Reeves. How could I forget that? So one of the things that's really clear is we see a bunch of things happening with boys. Increasingly, we see boys performing considerably worse than their female counterparts in school, starting at the lower grades and moving all the way through. And this seems to be leading to things like lower enrollment in university, right? University and college. So we're seeing lower enrollment. And we're starting to see, and like I said, we're seeing more and more of this debate that boys and men are increasingly being left behind in terms of kind of education and then all the things that follow from that. And, crudely, I think this has sometimes been blamed on feminism, though I think there's some increasingly sophisticated and kind of data-driven arguments that this is probably related to trends in education. And here, Leonard Sachs. Leonard Sachs is a really interesting person. He is a psychologist, right? So he's a PhD in psychology, and he's also a pediatrician, right? He's a medical doctor, and a really kind of, I'll say, a sideways thinker. Someone who's very grounded in the practical realities of medicine as well as treating people. And you can kind of see, what's on this list. Video games. Why do we have 5 factors driving the growing epidemic of unmotivated boys and underachieving young men? Video games. We'll talk about that later in the course. Teaching methods, right? And here, what he kind of points at, and Richard Reeves talks about this as well, is most teachers are women. And what Sachs suggests and what Reeves suggests is that, perfectly well-intentioned, they teach in ways that often don't appeal to boys. And one of the things that Sachs will say in this book is a lot of the things that are really normal for boys will sometimes get kind of punished or kind of squished down in elementary school especially. So things like writing stories, when it comes to drawing drawings or writing stories, boys will tend to focus on action and often, a lot of violence, and stories that boys write often are quite violent as well. And I can tell you this, I have boys. My 5-year-old, and I don't know where he comes up with these things, because it's certainly not something I don't think he's ever heard us say. He's been talking about creating these like stories and playing with his toys, and it's like, and then that guy got his legs cut off, right? And the Lego man is cut in half and his legs are over here and his torso is over there. And I'm like, okay, that went in a somewhat more violent direction than I had previously anticipated. Decapitations of Lego men are also frequent. Plus, they're super easy and you can put them back together. So, teaching methods is something Sachs talks about. The other one that I think is interesting, and again, I guess I find these two interesting, though the bottom one I'm not so sure about always. Prescription drugs, and especially here, right, one of the things that Sachs talks about is ADHD meds, right, and classing what he considers kind of normal juvenile male behavior as attention deficit disorder, and then treating it with some kind of relatively dire consequences, and then devaluation of masculinity is something that I think we'll talk about a little bit. We've talked a little bit about it already, particularly in work, right? Work, things like construction, manufacturing used to prize strength. As this has changed, right, as we've moved into more of a service economy, those careers that prize strength are less and less evident in the economy, and they certainly pay less well. And so it's left a lot of boys and men with a kind of uncertain economic future. Okay, so the other thing that has been suggested, we have a lot of educational policies that favor girls and women. And you can see, again, I don't want to overstate this. You've had a lot of, say, pushes for, to increase women in STEM, right? We have whole programs, like in Alberta, it's WISEST, right? Trying to remember what WISEST stands for. Women in Science, Engineering, and other things until you get the word WISEST. I can't remember what it all is. You've had a lot of programs, trying to push women into STEM fields, into things like medicine, but relatively little recognition that boys are struggling in different ways, right? Not at the expense of girls, but in different ways, that there's sort of problems that have come up for boys and that these are not being kind of addressed. Okay. Now, if we look at it kind of in the aggregate for the economy, what you'll find is that men still tend to economically outperform women. Though, this is kind of changing, right? And we're actually seeing, like, say, at the entry level careers, women are starting to be slightly ahead. Right? They're slightly ahead. Why? It really just goes back to this, right? More women are enrolling in undergraduate programs. Women are completing more programs. So women on the whole are more educated, right, than their male counterparts. So when you get to here, at the entry level, at least, women are slightly ahead. Now, some segment of men end up pulling ahead over time, right? You get men, there's a couple of things, right? They don't tend to take time off out of the workplace when they have children, so they move through the career chain a little bit quicker, and they tend to work on average, something in the range of 6 to 8 hours more per week, right? For women, the average is about 38 hours. For men, it's between 40 and 44 hours a week. So those extra hours lead to extra income. So men tend on the whole to outperform women, but if you take out the top 10% of both, so you take out the top 10% of women earners or female earners and the top 10% of male earners, then women are actually, increasingly ahead. Now, as we'll talk about in our next unit, right, which is families, which we'll talk about next Wednesday at 2:30, this is starting to, this kind of struggle of men and boys. Hang on, what do I have on my next slide? Oh, I'll do this because and then I'll talk about this. I'm going to put a star here to remind me about the families unit so I don't forget what I was talking about. Okay. Right. So I'll put it. I'll just give you some numbers. Right. College enrollment among young Americans gradually declined over the past decade. In 2022, right, total number of 18 to 24-year-olds enrolled in college was down approximately 1.2 million. And of that, most of this decline was fewer young men. Right? We're going to highlight that. Fewer young men pursuing college. And that's about 1 million fewer young men are in college compared to only 0.2 million fewer young women. Okay, so, and yeah, as a result, men now make up 44% of young college students today, down from 47 in 2011. And this trend is probably likely to continue. Okay, so all of this, and we'll leave it here because it'll tie into our next unit nicely, that we'll do starting next Wednesday at 2:30. We're starting to see all of this play out in really interesting social ways, right? And it's, this kind of struggle of young men is affecting the way that they move into kind of adulthood, romantic life, whether they're getting married and forming families, whether they're supporting their children. There's lots of kind of weird stats. This one, I'll give you this one. This is from a book called The Two-Parent Privilege by an economist named Melissa Kearney. 40% of children born in the US, are born to fathers that bring zero resources to their children. So they're deadbeats, which is kind of interesting, right? You've got 40% of children born in the US being born to to fathers who bring zero resources to their children, to the families that they're engaged in, right? And it's all kind of related, right? Their struggles economically, their struggles, educationally, all kind of tie together, right? And we'll talk about, some of the other things that happen. Women, as a result of their greater education, are more upwardly mobile. Right? So they're more upwardly mobile. They're wealthier. And this too is having a sort of effect because comparatively, these men and boys who are struggling, who are not, going to university, not upwardly mobile, right? They're either kind of stuck or they're downwardly mobile. It's, these women are not willing to partner with downwardly mobile men or men who are at a lower socioeconomic level than them. And so all of this, we'll talk about this, is probably contributing to, a fertility crisis, a drop in marriages, more women, being single for life. All of these things are probably related to some of these broader social forces that are happening. And we'll talk a lot more about that. There's other things going on as well, but at least some of it, right, seems to be related to, the fact that boys and men are struggling on a lot of metrics that we could talk about. So, can I please repeat what I said about families on the boys in uni slide? This one that I just finished talking about. So I said about university. Families. Because men are kind of struggling, right? They're not good marriage partners, right? They're not good kind of matches for the women because they earn less, right? They have more trouble holding down a job. They're less educated. They're less likely to form families, right? So we're seeing kind of delayed family formation. Amongst other problems, the men who are kind of call them marriageable, right? Women outnumber them. Marriageable women outnumber them. Meaning, there are fewer marriageable men than marriageable women, meaning that the marriageable men, take considerably longer to sort of make their decisions and are far more choosy because, they're sort of, shall we say, premium commodity. Men who are economically successful, wealthy, doing well, upwardly mobile, all of these things are kind of a scarce resource in the marriage market today for lots of reasons. We'll talk about this lots when we talk about families. It's a really interesting kind of question. But yeah, for whatever the reason is that boys, are enrolling in college less, right? So opting out of some of the better potential jobs in the economy, whatever the reason for this, and if it's video games, teaching methods, prescription drugs, environmental toxins, or the devaluing of masculinity, whatever it happens to be, it has ramifications, for men and women in general, right? It changes the kind of whole dynamics of the society in really interesting ways. Okay. I think I did. All right, so that is my last. I'm sad to discard all my ink. I'll keep it for now. I can always take it off later. All right, so I'm going to switch over to, my other slideshow, which is this one. Which is and it's the same, if you want to ask questions using the Slido. It's the same Slido code because I got this one to behave and use the same Slido. So, before I get started, I don't know if there's any questions, kind of general questions about the exam. Do feel free to ask them. I'll give you a second and then I will look at some kind of practice questions or example questions that you might see on your midterms. Similar things, right? Obviously these questions won't be there, but similar types of questions. These are all questions that used to be on the exam that I've taken out for various reasons. But I'll kind of walk through. Some of the reasons is I use them as an example question. I need an example question, so I cannibalized a past exam question and just kind of nerfed it. So, no question. Any questions? No questions. All right. Nothing. Going once. Going twice. I know. All right. So here, question like this. Define the term emerging adult, right? So, easy, right? An emerging adult, what would you say, is an adult between 19 and 29, right? And typically this is, someone who is legally an adult, but, still moving towards traditional markers of adulthood. I promise I won't write everything. I'll do point form in a second. Okay. So, and you could put here like, marriage, family, or children. These are some of our markers, home ownership, career, lots of different markers of adulthood that we think of emerging adults as kind of working their way towards, right? They're not quite there yet. Okay. So that should be, hopefully that's pretty clear. And that's for, 3 marks. If you have something like this, right? A definition that makes sense and some, examples like what are the markers? Those would all be things. Okay. When did this concept emerge? Time period or generational cohort? And here, really easy one is you could talk about the millennials, right? Because it's with the millennials that we start talking about emerging adulthood, right? With Gen X, or the silence, the boomers, Gen X. We really have this separation of kind of adults versus emerging adults. Everybody, you got out of high school, you got a job at the factory, or some of you went to university, you were adults, right? And you started building your life. With millennials, you have this longer period that starts. So, all right, if you identify millennials, I might have a Y in there, 2 marks. And then, using material from any part of the course, so you can use anything you want. We haven't done as much. We've done 3 units basically. We've done, history of youth and childhood. We've done generations, and we've done education. So you can pick out, kind of whatever reasons you might want. You just need to pick 2 of them. So you could pick one. It could be like, the need for increased education. Need for more education, right? So the high school diploma, it used to be, the base credential, but it's no longer the base credential. So we need more, you need more education, in order to succeed in the economy, which means your entry into adulthood is going to be delayed as you seek that, that extra, that extra education, right? So this could be, educational inflation, which we just talked about, right? Educational inflation. You could put like, student debt. Talked about that a little bit today, right? Student debt. Young people are more indebted than at any time in the past, coming out of education. So, they're not able to hit any of those markers of, of adulthood, right? They can't start a family, have kids. Those are 2 possible reasons. What else could you say, right? You could put other things, right? You could put, we're now in a slow life plan, right? Where we're not expecting young people to grow up as quickly. We're actually kind of prizing parents investing more and more in young people, and they actually mature much more slowly. Oh, I'm trying to think of if there's other ones. There's definitely other ones, and I had one in my head 2 seconds ago, and then it slipped away as my slowly building headache starts to take over. What was I thinking 2 seconds ago? I had another really good one, and it has completely escaped. Oh, the kind of self-help / individualistic ideology, right? That says, get to know yourself first, discover yourself first, and then once you're done all of these things, then you can, move into adulthood. If you wanted to, right, you could talk about, the birth control pill, which probably has something to do with it, right? People can now experiment sexually without marriage. And so they don't need to kind of, you don't need to get married early. You don't need to have a family right away, because you can, safely become sexually active without worrying about either of those things, right? That's the kind of culture that's happened, right? So there's lots of different reasons. And I will say, there's no straightforwardly, there are definitely wrong answers. There are things that you could say that would be nonsense. But, there's a lot of different things that you could put in here that would be right, that would, have a potential. And yeah, you'll just have to, there'll be a why. Why do you think these things? And I'll make sure on the questions on the midterm to add the why component so you remember to put it in, right? So you can explain, slow life plan, why, or self-help or individualistic ideology, why is that important, right? Okay. 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 So yes, you can do the exam complete entirely from home. You don't have to come in. The exam is not in person and on paper, right? And there's no study guide. The study guide is the lectures, and anything we're doing now. But I don't have a study guide for it. Only on lecture content. Yes. Is point form okay for the exam, or should you answer in paragraphs? Okay, so I would say don't use point form. And my only warning with point form is that people tend to get too brief with point form and they don't write enough, right? So I would write in paragraphs. I would definitely, give complete sentences rather than point form, just because I find that, when people write in point form, they go too brief, there's not enough detail, and you lose marks for having missed detail, right? Should you answer in paragraph? Okay, and what I will say, please make this as easy on me as possible. I'm just gonna clear what's here. One of the things that makes it sometimes really hard for me to mark things and find marks is when, so I have 3 sections here, right? So you could think of this as section 1, this one's section 2, and this one's section 3. I would say break these up, into like kind of chunks of text, answering each of the questions. It makes it a lot easier for me to find your answers when people just have this hard wall of text that has no spacing in between it. It can make it really hard for me to find. Yeah, let's mess that.
So I guess to add on to that, then should we treat them as like 3 separate questions to not like have like a kind of like an essay style and have to go into each one?
Yeah, so it's definitely not. I wouldn't say essay style. Like it's definitely short answer. Like you just need like a short paragraph kind of on each one. Does that make sense? But I would kind of break them up so that visually it's really easy for me to find where you're putting all of the information and try to organize them, so yeah, you're treating them almost as separate but related questions so that they're kind of building on each other, because sometimes people will put, for example, they'll write a bunch of stuff because they just, and I think this is normal for undergrads, start writing and then the definition of emerging adult is like right here in the middle. And I'm like, as I'm reading it, I just miss it because it's buried, in the middle of a bunch of text. And I'm trying to find these answers, but I'm sort of expecting, your definition to be at the top there. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Did I answer your question? Okay. Please.
So if the word count max was 300, that would be in total all of the different sections are going to equal up to 300.
Yeah, roughly speaking. But yeah, I mean, again, don't focus on this 300 number too closely. If you're at 400, I will still read it, and I'm not going to be like, aha, I stopped reading at word 300. I will not read anymore. And if it's 250 and you think you've answered it, you can stop. You don't have to write 50 other words. I only give 300 because I think on average, that's where the good answers kind of sit. But again, don't be like, oh no, I wrote 288 words. I need to find 12 more words to write. So, yeah.
If it was appropriate for the question, would you care if you use me first language, if you were to throw in a personal statement I believe or anything like that? Are you picky with that?
I don't care. For our purposes here, if we were doing essays, then we're going to go into some more formal language. The other thing I'll say, and I don't know if it's related to that or not, if you're bringing in information from outside of the course, just tell me where it comes from, right? So if you're I learned this by reading, Berger in SOC 212, or because sometimes people will have, all of our content kind of overlaps at times. So if you're bringing something in from outside, just tell me where it's from so that I'm not suspicious that this is Chat GPT bringing in a bunch of random information from nowhere. at least like give me some sense of where it might come from. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and like if we were to do that, you wouldn't want like an official citation or anything, just like in brackets, like burger, so 212 kind of thing.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be like formal. I don't need you to put it in an APA format or anything like that. I just like just a sense of where it comes from is all I really need. So yeah. Wait, there were questions on the slide. Okay, I answered you. Is the exam? No, the exam is open book. So like, there's no monitoring software. There's no proctoring software. You don't have to use SEM or ExamLock. You're free to use your notes and all of that stuff. So, open book. Have fun with it. Be specific. Like, bring in very specific details, right? Because like for example, if you have a question on the arguments that feminists make in terms of female occupations, right? I have a bunch of numbers in that slideshow, right? Like, okay, now 40% of family or 45 or whatever percent of family doctors are women, right? You can cite those. You can cite those charts. You can like look at that chart and say, according to the chart, in lecture slide, on the education lecture slide, men are enrolled in far more math-intensive STEM educational programs, right? So be specific, right? If you're kind of vague, it'll be fewer marks. So bring in as specific as information as you can. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes? Okay. So it's open book. Is there a maximum word count? No. But there is a time limit of 90 minutes. So, do judge your time carefully. The most common thing that happens to people where they lose marks, honestly, is they spend a lot of time on question 1 and 2, and they get to question 5, and they had like 600 words for question 1, and they have 112 words for question 5 because they just ran out of time. So yeah.
So it's like once you can do the exam at any time, but once you start it, like you have 90 minutes to finish.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you can. Yeah. Yeah. Chloe, go ahead.
So it's 5 short answers.
5 short answer questions.
Are the amount of material in each lecture that kind of like even like what you're gathering from? 3 lectures with 5 short answers.
Yeah. So I will attempt to split it. So it'll be more. Okay. I'll put it this way. It'll be more weighted towards. So there'll be more questions on. I'm articulating myself very well. I'm really sorry. On the generation stuff, on that, because we spent a long time on that, and a little bit less on education, and a little bit less on the history of youth and childhood. So I'd probably say like, 2 on youth and childhood, 2 on generations, and then 1 on education, I think. Does the exam automatically close after 90 minutes? Yeah, you're gonna see a timer at the top. When that timer hits 0, it's gonna auto submit whatever you have there, and so it'll stand, as it is. Okay, is the final the same format? I think so. Sometimes I have the final have 6 questions on it, and a little bit longer time period. But I actually have come to kind of like the 5 question format. It seems nice. So I probably will do 5 and 90 minutes for the final as well. Because they're really 3 midterms, right? They're not. The final exam isn't cumulative or anything like that. Are all the questions short answer? Yes. So 5. Okay. This question. So here again, you have to identify 2 things. How does Smith believe moral reasoning among millennials differs from moral reasoning amongst other generations, right? So we had a very specific kind of moral reasoning amongst millennials, right? And that was moral consequentialism. Okay. I would probably add for this, because this is a little easy for 5 marks, right? And explain and I, explain what that entails, because I have to move all my stuff over. Or no, I have to update the questions a little bit, explain what that entails. So here, right, with moral consequentialism, it would be, whether something is right or wrong is related to its consequences, right? Related to the effects. I don't know, consequences. I can't spell today. My brain is dying. So it's related to the consequences, right? So it could be okay to cheat, if you don't get caught. And if and if it doesn't hurt anyone else, right? Because this is some of the principles, right? So, that would be, kind of what you're looking for in the question. And you can go back to the examples, that I talked about in the slides, right? That, a lot of millennials would suggest that they are okay with, cheating as long as they don't get caught, right? They might steal if they don't get caught and all of this stuff. Okay. The second part, is what key philosophical trends have contributed to this type of moral reasoning. And again, I'll add a Y here. Does anyone remember? I know you haven't studied yet. Does anyone remember what the answer to this is? Nobody wants to, all right, so this was modernism, right? Postmodernism, right? And why would it be postmodernism? Well, postmodernism, right, as a philosophy says, there are no objective moral truths. No. And you can add here that, in their interviews, that many of Smith and Snell's participants couldn't understand the question, right? In terms of, objective truths, they didn't understand the question they were being asked. Like, what do you mean objective, right? So clearly something like postmodernism has seeped in deeply, right? And I talked a little bit about Foucault and Derrida and Friedrich Nietzsche and on all of this stuff, right? So does that kind of make sense, how you would answer a question like this? Again, I think all of this is pretty clearly laid out in the lectures. Okay, no questions. All right, so according to Postman, this one's easy. What role did the invention of the printing press in 1440, sorry, I'm missing a word there, that should be play, in the development of our modern ideas of childhood and youth? And then briefly describe the historical process that led to our kind of our modern ideas of childhood and youth. Okay, so, and again, I didn't put the breakdown, but I'll split that one 5 and 5. So, the printing press. What am I doing for time, by the way? Oh, lots of time. 12 whole minutes. So the printing press, how did it contribute? Or what role did it play? So you can say here that, the printing press, changed the information environment. Oh, I'm sorry about my handwriting. The screen wobbles. If I can get my Dell to work again, it has a kickstand so it doesn't wobble when I write on it. So it changed the information environment, right? Which led to a separation of children and adults, or those who can't read and those who can read. So basically, this forced a longer period of training. right? So you can kind of think of it, right, which happened in schools, right, which led to, literacy, which, Postman's argument is that generated, this, or brought back this notion of shame, right? Or kind of differences between adult knowledge and the knowledge of children. Okay, and what's the historical process that happens, right? So you get the printing press, which leads to, increasing literacy, which leads to, the development of schools. Schools, leads to, noticing differences between adults and children. And then you can say, like, noticing those differences leads to, increasing gradations, or increasing, I'll say gradations of difference, right? So we see, we start to separate them by age, but, because their abilities are kind of similar. We start to think about them at, we start to write pediatric texts. We start to, different clothes, longer and longer periods as they need more schooling. I'm running out of space on my slide, but then you can also say, right, the middle class, start to spend money on their kids. And eventually, they apply the same logic to poor children. So, sorry, I ran out of, it's hard to write on slides sometimes. Right, so they start to apply the same logic to the children of the poor. So then they create laws protecting the poor, which then will lead to things like mandatory public schooling, right? Because now those kids can't work and we need them, taken care of. We don't want them being juvenile delinquents. So we put them in public schools where they're going to learn those basic skills that they're going to need to go work in the economy later. And then you end up by, the beginning of the 20th century with a relatively modern notion of childhood as this very innocent, very delayed period where people are trained, through school and, kind of protected from the demands of the economy for, somewhere between 8 to 18 years, right? Depending on, or more than that, right? Probably like somewhere between 12 and 18 years, developing more towards 18 over time. Okay, sorry, does that make sense, right? Like the first part is kind of what happened, why the printing press, and then like tracing out the development from the printing press, to here, kind of chronologically. Good? Okay. All right, I think this is my last one. Yes. All right. This would be almost too easy, which is I think why I took it out. What technology or technologies were most critical to the social changing roles of women in the 1960s and 70s, and why? All right, so here there's a bunch that you can choose. I think the obvious one, and here maybe what I'll do if I have a question like this, maybe I'll spell it out. Like pick 2 technologies or something like that. But let's say we pick 2 technologies, right? So we're going to say birth control. And let's say the washing machine. Right, so we've got our 2 technologies. And then for each of these, right, you're going to want to give a why. So birth control, obviously, right, it's really simple. It allowed women to control fertility. So like delay having kids, choose the number of kids, which, and experiment sexually without those repercussions. Experiment sexually, right? all that kind of stuff, right? So all of this, so why, I guess why it affected it, basically separated sex and reproduction, allowed them to have many more working years, more years in school, right? All of this kind of stuff, right? And they wouldn't have been so restricted in the domestic sphere. The washing machine, right? And you could put the dishwasher here as well. Vacuum, great and powerful. The creature all cats fear, right? Any of these, right? And basically just outline, reduced domestic labor. Women, in a sense, where their time was consumed by household labor. And these machines, basically freed that time, without impacting families, right? So it allowed women to spend less time in the home, less time doing these domestic tasks, right? All of them could be automated, or many of them could be automated, and it allowed them then to go, into the marketplace, earn a salary without kind of a negative impact on the family. So really simple and straightforward, right? These are important labor-saving devices. So, all right.
I just have one question. I'm noticing that all of them are totaling up to a total of 10 marks for short answers.
Yes.
Does that mean our exam's going to be out of 50 marks then?
Correct. Because I'm lazy and adding things up out of 50 is really easy. It just it kind of works out that way for whatever reason. Yeah, they're all the questions are out of 10. And yes, the whole exam is out of 50. So the whole course will be out of 150 probably, or 160 if I add a 6th question to the final. Yeah, Chloe.
Practice questions for marks, like the ones posted on Canvas?
No, those ones are not for marks. I wouldn't do that. That's just mean.
Are you looking at them, or how?
No, they're just there kind of for, unless you want to ask me to, like if you send me a specific request, you want to write it out and just kind of see where I would grade it. I can do that on like a case-by-case basis, but not for all 60 of you. So if you really want me to look at yours because you're like, I'm not sure, but I wrote like a sample, would you just tell me kind of where I'm sitting? I'd be happy to do that. But like I said, on a case-by-case basis. So we have a week. Until the exam. So we're all good. All right, I think that's my last one. Any other questions? Other than that, I think I did okay. I have only 3 minutes left, so you get to go home early, but not so early that it's obscene. It's like, you get to go home an hour and a half early because I didn't plan. Okay, we'll see you next week. Any questions between now and then, fire me off an email. I'm happy to answer.